All right, everyone. My name is Steve App. I'm AVP of Marketing and Business Development here at SimpsonScarborough. And on behalf of our entire agency, thank you for joining us today as we publicly release our latest research report, the Higher Ed MarCom Professional Development and Salary Study. This report has taken us a bit of time to get into your hands. And if I can be candid for a moment, and I think I can because we're all friends here, this took us a bit longer to release than we originally intended. That's due in part because this study was initially designed to provide benchmarking data to empower higher ed marketing professionals to make data-driven decisions about their own careers and in support of their institutions. And to be clear, this report will still do that. But as we analyze the data, I think we realized that this study uncovered much more about the current strains on higher ed marketing and provided us a glimpse into potential future challenges that this industry and practice face. For some of you watching today, I think the data and the anonymous quotes that we present may be cathartic in a way. I presented a snippet of this report last week, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, "I'm just glad it's not me." Others may feel angry or frustrated. I hope many of you feel hopeful about the opportunities that this data provides us. Ultimately, if we're talking about feelings, I will share my feeling right now, which is gratitude. Gratitude to the hundreds of you who have taken the time out of your day to join us here for this conversation. A few housekeeping notes before we dive in. Yes, this webinar is being recorded, and yes, you will receive a copy of the full report following this webinar. If you have a question, feel free to use the Q&A feature. We'll also monitor the chat feature as best we can throughout this session and try to have a conversation with you as we go. So let's dive right into it. I'm joined today by a wonderful group of co-presenters. They include Emma Miller, our Director of Insights, Kevin Tyler, our Director of Community Engagement, and Jason Simon, our CEO and partner. And speaking of Jason, I'm going to let him set the stage for us today.
Great. Thank you, Steve, for the great welcome and the context. We're excited to have such a great turnout today and be able to share the results of this study and this research at a really, really critical time for our industry, as you noted. Quickly, we wanted to give everyone a sense of what we were going to cover today. By no means are we going to go over the entire report and all of the secondary findings. You'll, as Steve mentioned, get a full copy of the report by attending the webinar today. But we want to begin by maybe just giving a little bit of context on the study and sort of a reminder of the state of higher education marketing communications as a profession, as an industry, and sort of where that stood entering this study and the timing on when we did so. It's been a really challenging period with a lot of professionals moving positions, changing schools, leaving the industry, as well as challenges in filling open roles, getting approval for budgets for needed roles. But context on sort of where we landed is really critical. So we'll give you a good sense of the profile of the respondents. This is the first time that we have done this study, and our hope is to really continue to look into these issues in the future and continue to have a greater response in the future as well. A big difference is this study versus some other recent reports is that this is just marketing communications professionals at various levels of the organization. So that's a key point and a key difference. We'll talk about issues related to staff retention and promotion, some pay inequity, the pipeline for future leadership and mid-level leadership, as well as some early thoughts on a way forward. And as Steve said, we'll have plenty of time for some Q&A and can answer some questions in the chat as we move. So let's dive right in, Steve. We wanted to start by kind of reminding everyone and sharing some data that was from our annual CMO study. As we noted when we presented this information at the end of last year, there's been a real maturation on the CEO role, in particular in higher ed, over the last 7 to 10 years. These positions generally kind of lead their own divisions now, versus being embedded within advancement or enrollment. They report to the president or their chancellor of their institution, and for the most part sit on senior cabinet. That's a big shift because in 2014, just 49% of CMOs reported to the president directly, and you can see that number is now closer to 65%. So some big change there, and some evolution in the maturity of the leadership role in particular. Steve, if you move to the next one, challenges still remain though. I mean, nobody has ever thought in higher ed marketing that they had enough staff or budget to do the work that they were asked to do. This is where that sat when we asked the question about the ability to meet expectations in the CMO study. And as issues across campuses kind of intensified in the last 3 or 4 years, I mean, the reality is that many budgets have not increased, some decreased. Many schools have not kept up with inflation and other economic factors related to pay, and the demands on these roles and marketing communications have certainly intensified. And we know that many of you live those challenges every single day. So in some ways, it's the constant struggle for resources and value, but that pressure has really, really been intensified in a lot of big ways. So we wanted to give you a really, really good sense of who we surveyed and who the respondents are to this research. We had 875 total respondents across a variety of institutions and job role. We had nearly 70% women respond. We typically see, and in mall market research, there's generally more response from women. But I think this may also be some evidence of the number of women that are in marketing communications roles across campuses. And we'll talk more about that and the implications of some of the findings that we have. We have about 21% senior leaders, 39% directors, 24% managers, and 16% what we're calling contributors or producer roles, folks that are in non-management positions where they're directly responsible for a key area of work. We have a nice balance of public versus private institutions, and wanted to take a moment to talk about the racial breakout of the respondents, because I think that's really important. When we did our last CMO study, we had a question during the webinar on if we had any breakout of by race or ethnicity. And we had neglected to ask that in the demos that we collected at that time and in previous CMO studies, and made a promise that we would change that in the future. We asked that question here in demographics in this study, but honestly, we're disappointed in the small N value that we had for non-white respondents. So what does that mean? I mean, I think it means that we are obviously limited a little bit in our secondary analysis by what we can do by race and ethnicity. We did look for any significant differences from non-white respondents, and there were not any major areas of difference. Anecdotally, I will say that many of us find sort of the demos here by race to be kind of reflective of the teams that we work with on campuses regularly. And as much as we talk about improving access for students or hiring more diverse faculty, the reality is that those of us in the marketing communications professions need to take on the responsibility of also improving our practices and building more diverse and inclusive marketing communications teams as well. So we will continue to really try to make an effort to improve the N values in the non-white respondents, and we would ask for your partnership in really thinking about how we build diversity in our teams across campuses moving forward. So with that, Steve, I'm going to pass it on to you for some detail on the demos and getting us into the heart of the findings.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. I know Jason mentioned a few of the ways that we did break down this data. One method that we're going to heavily feature throughout this report is data broken down by seniority. We categorized respondents into one of four categories. The first are senior leaders. We heard from 181 individuals in this group. These are your CMOs, your VPs, AVPs, or VCs. These are professionals who spend the majority of their time on executive leadership, although I think it's interesting to note the prevalence of issues and crisis management for this chart. Their median age is about 50, and their median salary is $160,000. Next up are directors. We heard from 344 individuals at the director level. It's our most popular category from a seniority standpoint. These professionals spend the majority of their time on communications, although things like web management and paid advertising were also frequently listed. The median age for this group is 43 years old, and their median salary is $91,000. We also heard from 207 managers. These are your social media managers, digital content managers, public relations managers, et cetera. These professionals are primarily responsible for communications, website content management, and copywriting. Their median age is 38, and their median salary is $65,000. And then our final group are contributors. We heard from 143 contributors. These are senior copywriters, designers, photographers, et cetera. They primarily work on communications and content creation. Their median age is 36 years old, and they have a median salary of $54,000. So the major finding from this research is one that you've probably heard us share already in the past few months. It's the first stat, honestly, that made us realize that this research was not going to be just about benchmarking salaries. And that is that more than 2/3 of higher ed marketers are actively seeking new opportunities, and more than half are exploring outside of higher education. Now, the three top reasons that marketers are considering leaving are an desire for increased compensation, limited opportunities for advancement, and seeking new challenges. And those are not unique to higher education. I think we've seen that in so many stories that have been related to the Great Resignation. The one thing that I think is really interesting about the higher ed situation is that when we were looking at the open-ended responses from so many people who responded to this survey, it became clear that many of the people who were looking to leave or exploring new opportunities didn't or don't want to. In our responses, we saw so many people that reaffirmed their love and belief in higher education. But I think across the board, respondents tended to indicate that they had essentially just reached a point where they were no longer willing to sacrifice their economic or psychological well-being in the name of that mission. And I think that's a good spot to bring us into this first key section, which is about retention and higher education's retention issues. There's been a lot of talk recently about marketing's role in the retention of students, but it's really clear from this survey that we need to be looking a bit more intentionally and consider how we retain our own team members. So again, 68% of higher ed marketing is actively exploring, applying, or interviewing for new job opportunities. The good news, I think, here is that the majority of those marketers are open to staying in higher education. They're exploring opportunities both in and out. But I also think it's interesting to note that while the percentages are much smaller, when making the decision to look either exclusively outside or exclusively inside higher ed, more marketers chose to look externally from higher education. Now, when we break down these percentages by seniority, we can see that more than half of all professionals at all seniority levels are exploring new job opportunities. Senior leaders are the least likely to be exploring new roles at 53%. But I think it's actually still startling to see that among those who are looking at the senior leadership level, almost 40% were considering leaving the industry altogether. Directors and managers are the most likely to be looking. Nearly 3/4 of marketing professionals at those levels are exploring job opportunities, which has major ramifications for the future, which Kevin is going to be talking about a little bit later in this. And then finally, 1 in 5 contributors are limiting their search to opportunities outside of higher education, which is the highest percentage among all seniority levels in this report. Making this exodus a little bit more concerning is that more than half of those who are exploring job opportunities outside of higher ed said that they were somewhat or very likely to leave in the next 6 months. And I think this is a spot where I just want to pause and say that um, I don't think we can really underestimate the impact this has on our profession and our industry. Higher education is sitting in a moment in which there are more questions about the value of higher education than maybe ever before. And essentially, what we have is that at the same time that that's happening, more than half of the professionals whose primary responsibilities are communicating that value are looking to leave the industry. That is a major problem. Doesn't really have to be stated, but it's a major problem for higher education and for higher education marketing. Now, across the board, with very few exceptions, those looking to leave higher education report lower salaries relative to their peers at the same percentiles. I think this is especially noticeable at the senior leadership level, where those unlikely to leave make approximately 13% more at the 50th percentile and almost 40% more at the 95th percentile. It's a little bit less significant there at other levels, but generally that trend holds. And I think it's worth talking about the nuance here because, yes, increased compensation is such a major driver for wanting to leave, but it is not just about making more money. And I think that becomes really clear when we start to look at this data broken out by seniority level. When we look at senior leadership, for example, and the reasons that senior leaders are looking to leave higher education, we can see obviously right away that there's a difference between increased compensation with this group. The primary driver for senior leaders is actually to improve their work-life balance. I think it's also worth noting that just beyond the new challenge or growth opportunity and increased compensation is the desire to improve mental health, which undoubtedly is related back to that top choice of wanting to improve their work-life balance. These senior leaders are people who have led teams through, I would say for most, probably the hardest 2+ years of their professional careers. They've worked long hours, they've pivoted from their strategic initiatives, they've supported coworkers in the midst of their own personal challenges, and now essentially they're just burned out. Anecdotally, this is the group where I'm hearing from folks who are leaving their jobs without another job lined up. They're just giving themselves the space to rest and recharge. For directors, the picture is a little bit different. These directors really are focused on increasing compensation, looking for advancement opportunities. They have a frustration with workplace culture, and they're looking for new challenge and growth opportunities. These individuals really know that they're in the peak period of their earning potential for their careers. I do want to call out, though, the workplace frustration piece of this, because one thing we heard through open-ended responses was a real frustration from directors specifically with being called back to the office after leading teams as well as, if not better, than they had done previously while they've been working remotely during the pandemic. So yes, the overall theme here is a desire to advance for directors, but I don't think we should overlook the workplace frustration element of this. At the manager level, the picture is pretty similar, but I do think there's some important nuance here. You'll notice that the top 4 reasons for leaving higher ed are the same as directors, but they're in a different order, and the order matters. So I think we should note that the frustration with workplace culture kind of is in a different spot than it was for directors. I also think it's worth noting that mental health was also selected by this group more than 50% of the time. And I think this is where there's some nuance between the frustration with workplace culture between managers and directors. Directors are frustrated with being pulled back to campus, Managers are frustrated because in many cases, the bulk of the work that has been left from departing team members has fallen to this group. They feel underpaid. They're frustrated that a temporary solution maybe now doesn't feel so temporary. And much like senior leaders, they're essentially burned out after this 2+ year stretch. And then finally, for contributors, the picture is actually a little bit different here. Increased compensation is the number one reason. It's a percentage that's only matched by managers. But again, it's not just about the money. You'll note that the median salary between those who are looking and those who are not is the smallest of any seniority group. There's only a $1,000 difference. One of the key secondary reasons I want to call out is the ability to work remotely full-time, not just more flexibility, but the ability to work full-time remotely. That is the top 4 here. It's selected by 58% of contributors. Far and away, the biggest difference between them and other seniority levels. No other group had remote ability at full-time to be more than 50%. These are individuals who are not student-facing roles. So more than anyone else, they are really unable to understand why they are being called back to campus. I should note they also fulfill jobs that are really in demand across many industries right now. And I don't think that they're feeling the same sense of desire for their roles and their contributions or value of their roles and contributions within higher education compared to what they're seeing in other industries. So overall here, again, increased compensation, new growth opportunities, they were cited by more than half of all marketers who were looking to leave higher education. But other motivators varied significantly by seniority level. Senior leaders, far more likely to want to seek improved work-life balance compared to others. Directors and managers, more likely to name frustrations with workplace culture, although again, I think there's some nuance there. And I would also say that while much has been publicized about this demand for fully remote work, only given as a top 5 reason for looking to leave by contributors, where 58% said it was a leading cause. Maybe most notably in terms of the consistency between the different levels here, limited growth and advancement opportunities, the second most cited motivator for every segment except for senior leaders.
I think this is a really excellent segue into our next section around pay inequity in women in higher ed. Knowing that 70% of the survey respondents were women, and according to a study by Cupra HR, women make up more than 50% of heads of departments in higher education. We thought it was really important to look into things like pay inequity, responsibilities, years of experience, and how burnout is affecting women and their reasons for leaving higher ed. So we're going to touch on those 3 main pieces in this section. Unfortunately, this quote really summarizes what we're finding in some of our secondary and primary data, especially the first part around similar people in the same job classification out earning this particular person by 20 to 30K more, and really nothing being done to address that inequity. We're seeing this number being corroborated by different sources of information. So if we go to the next slide, the same Cupra HR study did a few different tracking of male and female salaries in administration and higher education over the course of 2001 to 2016. And they reported that this gap rose to above $20,000 in 2016. I understand that data is a little bit old, so there are 2 other pieces of information we wanted to bring forward that are a little more relevant and a little more timely. The Pew Research Center did a study in 2020 and found that women earned 84% of what men earned, including both full-time and part-time workers. The Institute for Women's Policy Research found major differences between race, ethnicity, in 2021. They found that compared to the median weekly earnings of white men working full-time, Hispanic women earnings were just 58%, Black women 63%, and white women 79%. So this is something that, as sad as it is to say, it's not surprising. It's something that's been a big topic of conversation for a long time. And what we're finding in our research is not specific, or higher education is not excluded from this particular scenario. Now, this slide in particular, it appears to be positive. When we ask specifically around how their salary has changed over the last 12 months, either increased, decreased, or stayed the same, there isn't a lot of differences between men and women in the VP and C-suite and AVP levels. The reporting majority of people have seen an increase in salaries. But what we know from research in pay inequity is that women are not starting with the same salaries as men due to various reasons. So although salaries are increasing, the inequity between men and women has never been corrected. So this leads us to find that the highest marketing salaries are still being reserved largely for men. So we broke this out by the different percentiles, 25th, 50th, 75th, and 95th between C-suite VP and AVP men and women. The AVP level, there isn't as drastic as compared to the C-suite or VP level. Men are still out earning women in terms of every percentile for that AVP level. What we are finding, though, in the C-suite level is that in the 50th, 75th, and 95th percentile, men are out-earning women, especially in the 95th percentile, where you see 17% men are out-earning women, which is a lot. And this is, again, just something really concerning. And I think it says, I think we need to consider what this data says about our industry. A lot of universities and colleges, their mission is something like social mobility and long-term career earnings. Knowing that women make up 60% of enrolled students today, those benefits of social mobility are going mostly to women. So what does it say when these colleges and universities, where social mobility is so core to what they do, are not paying women or supporting women on equal levels? So we're hoping that this information can shed some light and provide some transparency around salary conversations or inequities that may be happening at some of these institutions. So in addition to pay gap, there are some other gaps that exist among responsibilities and also years of experience. So we're finding a few things. I first want to draw your attention to the average years of experience. The very first line, it says years in MarCom. You can see there isn't a lot of years difference between men and women in the C-suite and AVP level. They relatively have the same level of experience in terms of numbers of years. But when you look up to see who they directly report to, men in the same roles as women are more likely to report to a president, chancellor, or C-suite. Now, at the beginning of the presentation, Jason reiterated some of the findings from our CMO study that showed that MarCom is becoming more of a central part in the cabinet and leadership level. So what does it say? That men are more likely to be included in those conversations and meetings and influencing strategic decisions compared to women at the same level. Something else that we found really interesting was the years at the institution. So you can see the gray bar that's highlighted. Women are more likely to have more experience at their current institution compared to men, while men have more outside experience outside of higher education, especially among the C-suite level. This kind of begged a question for us: is higher ed marketing experience undervalued at the highest levels of administration? So in addition to pay inequity and some differences between who you're reporting to and years of experience, there's also the really to what Steve was talking about in terms of feeling burnt out. That is having direct effects to the women in higher ed. So this study in particular, and this slide that we're showing, is not specific to higher ed. This is more in professional wide. But McKinsey and Company did a study for 2020 women in the workplace. And they found that women were twice as likely year over year to report feeling burned out than men, especially among senior leaders. There's two other really important things from this study that we wanted to call out that aren't on this slide. The first is that this study showed that working mothers were more likely than working fathers to reduce their hours at work, switch to less demanding job, take a leave of absence, or leave the workforce altogether. So this has a lot of implications on career progression down the road. The same study also found that women of color are also more likely to feel burnt out due to the microaggressions they face in the workplace. So things like being talked over, their value being questioned by other employees or their supervisors, or anything that they hear, they feel they are insulted or their culture is being insulted. So all of these things are eroding well-being for women at the workplace, and it's showing in some of our data specifically to women in higher education. So when we ask specifically why you're exploring other job opportunities outside of higher ed, there were some really key differences between men and women across all levels from senior leadership, directors, managers, and contributors. The first thing I want to point to is the increased compensation line. As you can see across the board, men are more likely to say increased compensation is a reason they are leaving higher education compared to women. So even though women are making less, that's still not as a high of priority for women in higher ed MarCom. What women are seeking is an improvement in work-life balance. So that is across the board from all levels of seniority. I especially want to hone in a little bit more on the senior leadership one. So 61% of women in senior leadership are looking for an improvement in work-life balance compared to 42% of men. Women are also looking for an improvement in mental health across the board. So 41% of senior leader women compared to 37% of senior leadership in men. So as we were kind of discussing, this isn't specific to higher ed. I think we've all heard various reports around the effects the pandemic has had on all professionals, but specifically women. But I think the way we think about this issue should be specific to our industry. Again, knowing that women, 70% of women were respondents to the survey and outnumbered men at every level of seniority. What would higher ed look like if a majority of those women went to different industries or worked elsewhere? What happens when the majority of our employees are being paid less, are struggling from elevated levels of burnout, and are increasingly looking for more flexible working arrangements? So as our higher education seems to be shifting more back to a pre-pandemic level work structures, we really need to think about what those structures are doing to our women and how to minimize those effects those structures have on women moving forward.
The other finding that was identified in this research are the potential vulnerabilities in the talent/leadership pipeline. And as we go to the next slide, I think it's important to just reference some context here around the labor market. Knowing that currently there are about double the amount of job openings as there are job seekers means the folks that we're going to be talking about on the next couple of slides, managers and directors specifically, have a lot of opportunities to find the kind of work environment they are looking for in response to some of the things that they're dealing with in their everyday lives now. And so looking at the next slide, we looked at managers and directors who have worked exclusively in higher education. And among directors who have worked exclusively in higher education, we find 66% are currently exploring job opportunities, whereas for managers, that figure is a full 90% of managers who have worked exclusively in higher ed who are currently looking at job opportunities, mostly outside of higher ed. This is significant for a lot of reasons, one of which is that these are the folks who carry a lot of institutional knowledge. They understand how to navigate the institution, its structures, and its systems and processes. And so them leaving the department is going to be a big hit for everyone else especially who are coming in without higher ed experience. And so when we look at the reasons, they largely mimic a lot of the reasons that we've talked about before. But if you take a look at managers who have worked exclusively in higher education, we see that improvement in mental health is one of the primary drivers for 50% of the respondents, one of the primary drivers for looking outside of higher ed for job opportunities. Moving on to the next slide, when we took a look at what the responsibilities looked like between managers with outside experience versus managers who have worked exclusively in higher education, what we found is those who with outside higher ed experience are largely responsible for marketing communications tasks, whereas those who have worked exclusively in higher education have kind of picked up other responsibilities. Here you see that about 30% of those folks are assuming admissions enrollment management tasks that are adding to the levels of stress and frustration that they might be experiencing in their work life. And so this is a situation, you can move on to the next slide. This is a situation that has become kind of a theme in higher ed, that over the past 2 years, this kind of all hands all the time temporary solution during the pandemic has now become more of a common practice, commonplace, everyday kind of existence. And it's it is having an effect. It's taking a toll on employees. And what that toll looks like, we'll show on the next slide, is that those in the communication, website content management and copywriting content creation set are 68, 65, and 64% respectively likely to leave higher ed altogether, because the past 2 years have been hard to get all the things done. It's COVID communications, recruitment, all of the things that are falling to these folks and their management responsibilities are leading them to leave the industry or look to leave the industry. And then we took a look at what the salary looks like, the salary differences look like between those with outside experience against those who have worked exclusively in higher education. And of particular note is the manager column at the top line, that average. Those who have worked exclusively in higher education have are making about $5,000 less than those working outside of higher education, with experience outside of higher education. And it's important to note that, as we just mentioned, about 30% in that exclusively higher ed cohort are doing more work that they're likely not being paid for. And then lastly, while both managers and directors cite increased compensation as a primary driver for their job exploration, 71% of the directors actually did report a salary increase in the last year, which is the highest of all of the cohorts. And only 58% of managers reported a salary increase in the last year. And while many factors are contributing to the exodus that we're experiencing in higher ed, one of the primary drivers, as we have repeated throughout this presentation, is the variance in salaries, especially in the middle of the pipeline, those directors and managers.
So where do we go from here, having seen some of the data and the themes that have been prevalent in this report? I think it's easy to look at the totality of this report and just say, well, higher education needs to pay its marketing professionals more and needs to pay them equally. And to be clear, I think that would be a great thing. That would be a welcomed response to this survey. Marketers, I should say, at the director, manager, and contributor level, all listed increased compensation as their primary reason for leaving the industry. And for senior leaders, it was the second most common reason. So I do not in any way want to discount that reaction to this. But I also think that focusing on salary as a silver bullet here is both overly optimistic and simplistic and unrealistic. The stress faced by marketers are not so minimal here that they can be fixed with a higher paycheck. And I also think we should acknowledge that colleges and universities, who are, as we mentioned before, staring down questions of value, an upcoming demographic shift, a balance sheet that no longer includes an influx of pandemic relief funds, they are unlikely to broadly and suddenly increase the salaries among its administration. So if that is not a simple or realistic fix moving forward, what can we do? And this is where we have just a few initial thoughts. First, I think we need to change the way that we talk about our own profession. Higher ed marketers at every level have long bemoaned the lack of sophistication in higher education marketing, especially when they're comparing themselves to the private sector. In my opinion, I think we're starting to see the impact of those words. Across the board, marketing professionals with experience outside higher education are being paid more than those who have worked exclusively in higher ed. They're tasked with fewer responsibilities than those who have come up exclusively within the industry. At the most senior level of our profession, as Emma shared earlier, men are paid more than women. They're more likely to report directly to their president or chancellor. This despite no meaningful difference in their reported experience in marketing and communications. The difference, aside from gender, is that men report a higher number of years spent outside higher education. If we don't kind of change this narrative about higher ed marketing's shortcomings, I think it's inevitable that we're going to see more talented individuals move on to other industries, which is going to force supervisors to spend valuable time and budget resources hiring new team members at higher salaries to do a smaller number of things, which is a broken cycle that I think we should all want to avoid. Second, I think we need to come to the realization that these issues are not likely to be solved quickly. I think we can and we should use this data to become better support systems and advocates for our team members and peers. But we also need to focus our mental energy on succeeding within the environment that we find ourselves in. I think when I've talked to supervisors, and I would say CMOs in particular over the past several months, I've heard many essentially describe themselves as full-time human resource professionals because they're just spending the majority of their time attempting to backfill a constant stream of departures. And that work is mentally taxing. And we also know that the candidate pools for those open roles, at least to date, have been described as shallow and weak in a report by the Chronicle of Higher Education. So that work is also just less than fruitful. I think it's also worth noting, because Jason mentioned the CMO study at the start of this presentation. That study also showed that higher ed allocates more than half of its entire budget, about 56%, to labor expenses. And going back to those comparisons to the private sector, that number for the private sector is about 25%. So for CMOs, I think now might be the time to reconsider which positions within your team are truly mission critical to maintain as full-time in-house positions, and then which positions might be better served through external resources. Third, we need to build more diverse teams that better reflect the audiences that we serve. We noted the 88% of respondents to this survey who were white. A recent employee retention survey by Coupa HR, which analyzed almost 4,000 higher education employees from all across their respective campuses, had 80% of its respondents who were white. With very, very few exceptions, I think we can all acknowledge that these percentages that we're seeing do not reflect the demographic breakdown of the students who are enrolled on our campuses. They certainly don't reflect the broader demographic breakdown of our country or those who are seeking college degrees. For supervisors and hiring managers, then, I think marketing's retention challenge should be seen as an opportunity, not just to rebuild our teams, but to rebuild our teams in a way that makes roles more diverse, inclusive, and reflective of the audiences that we aim to reach, influence, and serve. That starts, and I want to say we are not experts in terms of that hiring practice, but I think we can say that that starts with making the hiring process more equitable. If you can, consider revisiting your education requirements, share salary information, put the salary and the job description as early and as often as possible. Consider standardizing your interview process to reduce the bias that is inherent in those processes. And also look to post open positions on more targeted job boards. One that I've seen more higher education campuses and organizations moving into, which is a great job board, is blackmarketers.org as an example. We have to be reaching out intentionally into new spaces to try to bring out new candidates and future employees. Fourth, I hope we'll use the turnover that we've already experienced to keep directors and managers from leaving. These are the cohorts who were more than anything frustrated by limited advancement opportunity. They are craving new growth opportunities. They're the most likely to be looking to leave our industry. And as we're seeing the current cohort of senior leaders who are looking to leave the industry because they're burned out, we need to ask ourselves where that pipeline is if our managers and directors are also or more likely to be leaving the industry. Now, they are looking for increased compensation, and that is something that is maybe tough to come by right now in higher education. But beyond increased compensation, managers and directors most desire growth. And I think the sheer volume of open positions within our teams means that growth opportunities may be the one thing right now that are not in short supply for marketing offices on colleges across this country. So let's lean into that to see if we can promote from within to give those individuals the growth opportunities they seek and to keep them from leaving. Finally, pay women. Pay them equally. It is 2022, for goodness sakes. And as Emma said earlier, so much of what higher education is about is social mobility, equality, things that make an enormous impact on our economy and our society. And if we are not ourselves reflecting the values that we promote, what the heck are we doing here? So 5 things that I would recommend we do in relation to or in response to this survey. And with that, Jason mentioned we'd have plenty of time for questions, and we do. So I'm going to pull the screen share down, make sure our entire team is here and present, and let's dive in to questions and answers. Let's see. Where do we want to start? Okay, so here's a question from an anonymous attendee who says, can you expand upon what is factored into frustration with workplace culture, if that is more than being forced back to the office rather than working remotely? So for this anonymous attendee, I would say certainly that is a key piece of it, right? Is this idea of being forced back to the office. We've all proven we can do our jobs remotely. I think it's more than that, though, which goes back to the nuance. And I'm looking at the timestamp. Maybe we address this after this question was asked. But I think for directors, it is a frustration of being called back, of managing those teams well in a remote setting and now wondering why they have to go back. For other positions, I'm not sure that it's just that. In the open-ended responses that we got within this report, we did see lots of concerns about having to do multiple jobs, more than just what they were hired to be doing, without any sense of increased compensation that was coming as a result of that. One of the things I was thinking about when I was reading these open responses was so many marketers have answered the call the last 2 years. They have been asked to, generally speaking, do more with less, and they have risen to that occasion. And I think for many marketers, they're wondering what that was all for. And if, again, a temporary solution is maybe less temporary than they initially suspected. I don't know if others felt differently about that question, though. No, wonderful. Okay. Let's go to a question from Kim Sejpal at the University of Redlands, who wonders if any intel is coming up by state and type of institution. The simple answer there is not by state, but we did break down some of this by region, in particular the salary data that we're sharing, which is in an appendix of the report. I will say that one of the reasons we focused on seniority breakdown is because there were no major differences when we just looked at this by state or by public versus private institutions, which might be a little frustrating in some, surprising, I would say, in some ways when we think about maybe salaries especially. But the biggest differences seem to be with the seniority levels and with the gender pay gap, as we mentioned. And then a question from Nate, who wonders if university athletics communicators were included in the study, either intentionally or not. I will say that if they were, it was incredibly minimal. The vast majority of respondents who answered this were in the central marketing communications offices. We did ask about other offices, whether they were in individual schools or colleges or within departments where they contributed to marketing. This is a very anecdotal response, Nate, but I don't believe I saw athletics among the group, but I can get back to you on there because with 875 responses, I definitely may have missed one. Oh, go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the chat that I just wanted to highlight because they're not in the Q&A. But Matt Netter asks, how do we make this more than just preaching to a choir of underpaid, overworked employees? Can we get the decision makers to attend next time?
So I'll jump in there. I think, Matt, it's a really, really great point, and some other folks asked similar or made similar comments in the chat. One immediate thing that I will say, and I know my colleagues here on the call feel the same way. You're going to be getting this full report. It has a ton of other additional data and detail. I would encourage you to share that with your leadership. And, I will offer up our time if you need a voice of conversation with your leadership, or you need somebody from our agency to pass something on to somebody else. We're here for you, and, are willing to make our voices heard. Another person asked earlier too, if we were going to be kind of expanding on some of the findings here and doing some thought leadership or some other kinds of things that could be shared. There is an executive summary that's within the final report that you'll get. So even if you don't want to share the whole thing, you'll be able to share that. But we will definitely be developing some content and continuing to talk about this as a theme. We really believe that it's critical. These issues that we've raised here are critical to the long-term success and the maturation of our industry, and thus, given the voices that higher education marketing communications professionals play in professing value, in talking about all of the challenges that the industry faces, these roles play a really critical part of the long-term viability and success of higher education. So we're here for you. Let us know how we can help and support you directly on your campus. If you have groups that you manage or that you're a part of regionally, we're also happy to drop in and share some of this data and some of the other contextual industry things that are going on, and make that case on your campus or in those regions. I think just one other quick thing before we get to another question I would just add is, if there are places, we have a lot of really wonderful, smart, talented communications professionals that are on this call right now. And if there are places that you think that we ought to have some level of outreach to media and other professionals around some of these findings, we have done some, but we are willing and intend to do more. So, if you've got a connection that you want to leverage for us, do not hesitate to reach out.
Jason, there's a question that came in somewhat late about the pipeline and some of the ways that we can recommend or offer more growth opportunities within a rigid staff structure. And I was thinking about how we talked about the directors and managers yesterday, and the part that you mentioned about the understanding of the political environment and how that is valued at some levels, but not other levels. And I think that does speak to some of the growth that we're looking to offer within team members. I don't know if you want to bring that back up in here.
You'll have to remind me of the exact point from yesterday. Feels like a long time ago. You know, I think holistically, like thinking about that issue, you know, one challenge that we have, I mean, and some people have pointed it out in the chat and in the Q&A, the HR structures at both public and private institutions are really, really rigid and do not make any of this easy. In addition, the budgeting structures are really challenging too. I mean, for the public institutions in particular, you know, we're seeing schools that are starting to freeze salaries once again, freeze hiring, you know, and then you've got many states that have, you know, merit increases that are, you know, many years overdue and are coming nowhere near inflation. So all of those things pose challenges. I think that there are some things that are within the data here that are really important for us to use as leverage points with the other professionals and administrators on campus. But more importantly, I think for us to consider as we think about talent and moving talent through our organizations. I mean, I was really struck by the points that Emma noted around, you know, the years of experience in particular that an AVP or director has on a campus and with an institution. And then generally how those positions are paid so much less than either somebody coming from the outside or a male in a more senior role. And those are the pipeline of the next talented sets of leaders, whether we are talking about, you know, the mid-level professional or the senior most professional. And I think one thing that has happened with the maturation, and maybe this is what we were talking about yesterday, Steve, one thing that has happened with the maturation of the industry as a whole is we've become much, much more complex marketing communications organizations. The things that marketing communications professionals need to do in higher ed are so much more complicated than really well-defined marketing roles in the corporate side in particular. We have to be experts in recruitment and in literal, you know, physical, mental health and safety issues, right? One person has to have that same expertise. We're burning those same people out. They're leaving for much more defined and structured roles that are outside of higher ed, and then coming back and being paid more than when they left. But we're losing all of that. We're losing all of that experience that they had on campus. We're losing the relationships that have been built, you know, and it's just this churn around these positions and a churn at the leadership level of the university that is just a really, really bad cycle.
Thanks, Jason. And with that, we've amazingly reached 2 o'clock. That was the fastest hour of my week, I think. So I want to thank everyone who joined us today and again took time out of their busy days to hear about this data. I hope this is helpful. I hope this helps support you, helps you advocate for more money, helps you advocate for better hiring practices or more flexibility. As we've all noted, I think there's a lot of rigidness there, but hopefully surveys like this and studies like this can at least help a little bit. I also just want to put a plug in for the next piece of research coming out from SimpsonScarborough, which is the 5th wave of our national student survey, looking at incoming college students and their thoughts on society, as well as the value of higher education and everything that occurs when they're evaluating or considering the next step in their educational journeys. That report is going to be released at the end of September. We hope that you'll join us, and we'll make sure to get the word out once we have a specific date for that presentation. But again, thank you so much for being here with us today. Other questions, we hope you'll definitely keep reaching out to us through other channels. But until next time, keep on keeping on. Thanks, everyone.
Steve, I think we're going to stay on for an additional 10 to 15 minutes. So if anybody wants to stay on and chat a little bit more, we can do that as well.
Oh, awesome. Look at that.
Executive decision made.
Amazing. Okay. Let's see. Are we answering questions? Is that what we're doing then for the next?
Yeah, I think there's a couple in the Q&A that we can address if you want.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay. Ray asked, apart from just budget, did you get a sense of having the technology tools needed to do the best work? We didn't ask about this in this study, but Jason, this actually kind of reminds me back of the MarTech study that I know we released in 2021.
Yeah, it was we did that in 2021. We can make that link available to Ray and to others. I think one of the things that was really interesting from that, now thinking back to it, was an overinvestment in people versus technology in relation to other industries. And I think that's easy to discount that and sort of say, hey, in other industries, they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars and we're lucky to have $500,000. But, the reality also is our units are stretched and we're not leveraging technology in a way to kind of maximize the positions that we do have. And so again, I think it points back to that point that you made early on, Steve. How are we taking the moment of time that we're in, and instead of immediately thinking that we need to refill positions when people leave, thinking about defining roles and in a better, more consistent way, leveraging technology and MarTech and leveraging outside partnerships, then we won't find ourselves in these positions where we don't have any flexibility in our salary dollars. We don't have changes in our operating budgets, and we're really limited because the only move that we have is a staff position move. We haven't given ourselves that level of flexibility.
I think the last question is if there's data on authority at job level or reach of oversight. I'm just going to read this word for word. For example, job roles that oversee just graduate or undergraduate marketing, or both, or if they oversee a single academic school. I don't know who, it's an anonymous question, so I don't know who it came from or if they're still here. If they are, we do have that data in terms of those who are centrally located and those who are in, I guess we would call decentralized environments. So they work within a single school or college, or I don't think we got to the granularity of just overseeing something like graduate marketing versus, or graduate enrollment versus undergraduate enrollment. But I can look into that and get back to you, and anything that would be in the report will be sent out right after this webinar.
I think one other point that I wanted to just pull up from the chat earlier, Terry Flannery brought up I think a really good point around the role that search firms can play in, especially at the executive level, helping and supporting some of these conversations, making the data known. And, there are several search firms that, one of their areas of focus is around the executive marketing communications searches. And I would encourage those of you that have been engaged and have relationships with those search firms, certainly we will, to share the findings and the data here. I think that they can have a really, really big and important role in informing the HR professionals and the senior most administrators on what the positions need to be paying and the benefits packages and those kinds of things. Unfortunately, those are generally the VP level positions only that search firms are typically engaged in. And so I'd like to see that same level of data shared with the HR folks on campuses too.
Yeah, and I think the point that Anne-Marie just made too, of that challenge of the lack of strategic alignment between university priorities and then the resourcing required to support those priorities. I saw earlier in the chat, and I can't remember who said that, but a note about proving the ROI for marketing and the fact that enrollment an advancement have such clear ways in which they can prove their ROI for increased budget, but it's a harder thing for marketing. And I think that also harkens back to the CMO study that we had, where we talked about the percentages of CMOs who were responsible for essentially brand health versus the percentage who had pieces in place to measure the ROI of that brand health, which was much more different. That still feels like a nut to crack for higher education to get a little bit more, I would say, political buy-in within campus.
Agreed. It feels like we obviously, as you said before, Steve, we could keep this conversation going for a really, really long time, and it would generate a lot of really good ideas. I think that we have addressed most of the notes in the chat. And I don't see any more open questions.
No more open questions. We've addressed those. Okay, y'all, I'll say it then. Thanks again for joining us today. And we'll talk to y'all real soon. We'll get the report, the full report, into your hands here momentarily. Thanks, everybody.